Hi everyone, welcome to the October 6th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a moment by my co-host, Craig Mulkowski. Well, there's a lot of racing to recap on the podcast this week. From between Friday, even going back to Thursday, especially Saturday and Sunday last weekend, just a ton of graded stakes racing, many preps for the Breeders' Cup. The centerpiece, though, around the country was probably the last jewel of the Triple Crown. That was the Preakness. Obviously, the Triple Crown won't run in an unusual order this year, and the whole racing calendar was kind of turned upside down by the coronavirus pandemic. But we did finally compete the Triple Crown, and let's just jump right into the racing, Craig. I think it's safe to say that they saved the best one for last, because this Preakness was a pretty special battle to behold.
Yeah, I mean, this was a fabulous race. Not much more you could want. You had the filly versus the colt who had won the Kentucky Derby. Filly, who we've been seeing campaigning all year, had tried the boys earlier in the season in the Bluegrass, and basically shows up every time. What a throwback. I think I saw a tweet, retweeted it out, that she's run 9 times this year, and of those 9, they all came at different racetracks, which is, the 9 itself is something we rarely see. But to ship that much is just incredible. And to top it off with a Preakness win over the boys was just incredible. Quite the stretch drive. I think the race was pretty much in doubt all the way down to the wire. Those two were pulling away, and it was a fast race. The winner, Swiss Skydiver, got a 1:27 TimeformUS. Authentic, a 1:26, and then it was a huge gap back to Jesus's team. So just a really fun race, and part of the reason why I'm even involved in this sport. These are the kind of races that got me into it.
Yeah, no, just watching this race, it's one of those that even when you're seeing it live, you can kind of envision yourself going back 5 years from now and watching this race again, just as a fan of the sport, because it's one of those that really does get your heart pounding to see these two horses coming down to the wire together, trying so hard. And I agree with you. I thought the result was in doubt right up until the end, because we know Swiss Skydiver pretty well at this point, and while has a ton of talent and has won her races pretty easily against the fillies, I mean, the one thing you can say is the few times that she's been in a real fight to the finish, she hasn't always shown the most heart. As a 2-year-old, she was known to kind of give it up in the last 16th of a mile sometimes, but she's just really taken her game to another level recently, and I've got to credit the ride that Robbie Alvarado gave her. I mean, he just did everything right, coming down the backstretch. I mean, we could talk a little bit about the pace of this race. They were moving slowly up front, and it was kind of, you're waiting for somebody to make the first move, because the first quarter was so slow. Even the half, they picked it up a little bit, was still pretty moderate for the distance, but he made that early move to the front end on the backstretch, and that really just changed the complexion of the pace. They really picked it up coming around the far turn, and they just kept going, and nobody else could get into the race. He just gave a masterful ride on her.
Yeah, I would agree. It was actually the ride that she didn't get in the Oaks when the rail was left open. The rider that day, Tyler Gaffalione, elected not to take it, but who knows what would have happened if he had that day. Maybe it's a different result, maybe not. It's hard to say. Different races, but Alvarado was aggressive here and took it, and it certainly paid huge dividends.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot to say about the rest of the field. I mean, Authentic, I think he ran back to his Derby performance. The speed figures would confirm that. He was just second best to a better horse on this afternoon. The others, I mean, they finished way back. They just didn't quite get involved in this race. We've got some talented 3-year-olds out there, but I think the top 2 are just on a different plane. Let's move on to the race right before the Preakness. It's also for the 3-year-olds. This was for the fillies, the Black-Eyed Susan, grade 2 event. And we had an upset here. Bonnie South, I think she was a single on most people's pick 5 or pick whatever sequences coming into the Preakness. She was supposed to beat this field, but she is a horse that's a deep closer, and there are always risks with horses like that at short prices. She was a little hesitant at the start, got squeezed back, and just had too much ground to make up on Miss Marissa, who's in great form right now.
Yeah, she is. We talked about it on the forecast. It's kind of what you get with a deep closer. I'm always leery to take those kind of short price for exactly the things that happen. Now, that said, I wasn't smart enough to come up with the winner, Miss Marissa, but no knocks on her. I mean, she's been running great. She'd won her last 2 easily. She was able to handle the jump up in class. She got a 1:16 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, which is solid for 3-year-old fillies. It's not the grade 1 type of race we've been seeing earlier. It's some figures we've seen earlier in the year from this strong crop, but it's solid enough. It was a good grade 2 effort, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, this is a horse that had shown a little bit of talent early on in her career, but had just kind of gone the wrong way for a while. And her trainer, Jimmy Ryerson, just seems to have gotten her into top form lately. Obviously, he's not a trainer that has a lot of top horses, to say the least. You're probably used to seeing him in a lot of lower level claiming races in New York, but he was the trainer on Unbridled Song back in the 90s. And it's just nice to see him have another good horse because Miss Marissa has really taken that step to the next level. She's not among the best 3-year-old fillies out there. I mean, she's no Swiss skydiver. And I mean, there are a lot of talented 3-year-old fillies in this crop. And I don't think we can yet talk about her in this same breath as those horses, but she did get the graded stakes victory on this day. The biggest speed figure that we saw on Saturday at Pimlico was on the turf in the Grade 2 dinner party, right kind of smack dab in the middle of the card, as Factor This fended off his main challenger, Some Like It Hot Brown. Both of these horses handled the softer turf conditions well enough, but Factor This was just too much for the other horse to handle.
Yeah, and what a year this horse has had. He just seems like he's been running all year. He's run several times, always running really well. And he got a huge number on this day, a 131. Now, I'm always leery of figures like this on a suspect course, on a softer course that we had at Pimlico, but we talked about this the last time Channel Maker ran, and we saw he was able to come back in a race we're going to talk about a little later. So, I mean, I have no knocks whatsoever on this horse. We talked about him the last time he ran. It's hard to say where he's going to fit in the Breeders' Cup. I would suspect if he goes, he's probably more of a horse for the mile. I'm not sure where else he could fit in. He certainly isn't going to cut back to the sprint. A mile and a half's too far, but he's proven good from as short as a mile up to a mile and a quarter, and just a really solid campaigner.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Breeders' Cup implications with a lot of these races and where some of these horses might be going off their victories in these prep races. And it's not always so clear because you got a horse like Factor This who can run over a lot of these middle distances. I would imagine the mile's the better fit for him if they decide to go there. But we'll see. Some of these horses, there really isn't a perfect Breeders' Cup race for them all. And maybe that's just the case with Factor This. We'll see. But he's obviously very talented. Like you, I would kind of take this speed figure with a grain of salt because of the turf conditions. He's obviously the kind of turf horse that runs over anything. We've seen that from him over the past couple seasons, but he is in great form right now. The last race we'll talk about from Pimlico that's going to have implications for the Breeders' Cup is the Grade 3 Chick Lang from Thursday's card. And Yopan beat a field of overmatched 3-year-olds. Did it the right way, beating them by daylight, earned another respectable speed figure. This is obviously a horse with a lot of talent. I think it remains to be seen where he fits within the greater context of the older sprinters out there.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, this is 4 tries, 4 wins. He got another 123 TimeformUS speed figure. But as you mentioned, it was pretty much a paid workout. There was nobody in here who could even warm him up. The pace projector had him with a clear lead, even in a race that predicted a fast pace. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, he's quick enough. It's not like he's walking on the front end in these races. He went pretty fast to get that lead and just put away the overmatched foes. Most years he would be a horse would readily toss if he jumped into the Breeders' Cup Sprint next time, but this year just hasn't been the strongest for sprinters, so I'm not willing to write him off yet, especially with his high early speed.
No, I mean, the Breeders' Cup Sprint is turning into a totally wide open race. Based on the recent speed figures, he is faster than the older horses. It's just a question of class with him because the fields that he's been beating in these 3-year-old races are not quite up to the level that I think he's going to face in the Breeders' Cup Sprint. That's going to be a test for all of these horses, but he does have plenty of early speed. That's going to be an asset in a race like that, you would think. It just remains to be seen how he classes up and how the Breeders' Cup Sprint comes up, because we'll get to it later. There's another prep we're going to talk about. And I think that some of the fillies are going to consider the Sprint this year. I don't know that for sure. I know that you've kind of been mentioning Serengeti Empress for the past couple weeks now as a horse that should be considering the Sprint. And I have an inkling that there will be some crossover with some of the fillies choosing this race instead. But we'll see how that develops when it comes pre-entry time.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be one of the more fascinating races on the card when the entries come out, because it's just hard to say. There's some males who could go in the mile, could go in the sprint, but I'm sure we'll talk about that later. So let's move on.
And let's move on to another venue, that being Keeneland. ran a ton of Breeders' Cup preps this past weekend, and we'll try to talk about as many as we can. Let's begin with the Saturday racing there. They ran a trio of Grade 1 races, a couple on the turf. The one that's going to have the biggest implications for the Breeders' Cup Mile was the Grade 1 Shadwell, which was won in an upset by Ivar. This race was obviously affected at the scratch time when Halliday came out. He was likely to be the favorite in this race and likely to be the controlling speed. Who knows what he would have done in this race? I don't know what the reason was for him being scratched. But Ivar is a horse that has just continued to step up with each start since coming to this country. And based on my eye, this was a totally legitimate win. I don't think it was some kind of fluky performance.
Yeah, I don't think so at all. He's a horse who came from South America, and he's improved his speed figure every single time out, this time making a big jump up to 126, which would put him right in the thick of things in basically any Grade 1 race we run at a mile in this country. I thought what was interesting with him was the change in tactics, where he came from pretty far back. He was shown second in the pace projector in a race that we thought had a decent amount of pace, but he was much further back than that. And it worked out for him perfectly. He made a big run late, and I mean, make no doubt about it, he was absolutely flying. And this was a fast race. We had the filly and mare version of this race go a couple before, and it was just a much faster race. So if this horse shows up in the Breeders' Cup, he's certainly going to be a dangerous one.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. It seemed like he came over to this country without some confirmed running style, and it was as if his connections didn't really know how to ride him in his first few starts. You might remember, we actually handicapped his first race in this country, and we did a TimeformUS forecast way back when only a few tracks were running in April and May. And I remember watching this horse's Argentinian races and just being so impressed by him, because he just looked like he had so much talent, even though you didn't know what he was beating. And he didn't get the best trip in his first start over here, but he's just continued to improve with each start since then. And it seemed like he benefited from the blinkers when they got more aggressive, but it was nice to see him show that versatility to come from further back in the pack here. And I don't think it matters how he runs or where he comes from. He just shows up with a big performance every time now. And I think he's a player in the Breeders' Cup Mile. We'll talk about some other preps for that race and how deep that race is coming up, especially if some Europeans make the journey over from Europe. But he seems like a player in that race to me.
Yeah, I would agree, and I love the versatility. It just say speed's never a bad thing, but when you can drop off the pace and make a run like he did, it just shows he's got just a ton of talent.
And speaking of those Breeders' Cup Mile preps, we saw another one in the Grade 1 First Lady. I would imagine that they would try to make a second go at that race with Uni, who, of course, was the 2019 Breeders' Cup Mile champion, when Phillies finished first and second in that race as she beat her nemesis Got Stormy in that edition of the race. We'll see if the race comes up in a fashion this year where Udi can win it again, because she's not running the kind of speed figures that we saw out of her last year. And while she got the job done over some very good horses in this First Lady, I think that the trip and the fact that some of her rivals perhaps weren't at their best may have helped her a little bit.
Yeah, it could have. She only got a 119 speed figure for the win. I say only because she was a horse who was running in the mid-120s a lot last year, including her win in the Breeders' Cup when she got a 126. I don't want to knock it too much, but it just wasn't as strong a race as you said. Newspaper of Record set the pace, or didn't set the pace actually, set off the pace of Crystal Lake, and it just wasn't a very solid pace. So that one was a little puzzling to me. I think that took her out of her best game, and maybe she's just not a two-turn horse. She's done all of her best running at shorter distances, or around one turn or shorter distances. So maybe that would be the thing for her. But of the other horses in here, I think Beau Recall didn't have much chance given that moderate pace that we saw and dropping way back to last. So maybe I'd give her an excuse. But she's another one. I'm not sure where she fits in the Breeders' Cup. She'd probably be more a filly and mare turf kind. But Uni, I'm with you. I wasn't as impressed as I was last year. I imagine that's where they'll take a shot, but she's one I'd probably be against.
Yeah, there's obviously been a lot of theory and chatter about Newspaper of Record and what's the right thing for her to do. What does she really prefer? Maybe she's better on yielding ground than she is on firm ground. I mean, and you could come up with all these theories. I think at the end of the day, what it is, she's a very talented horse, but she's not a competitor. I mean, she wins races where the fields are overmatched and she's able to just go fast every step of the way, never see anybody else. It's like she's out for a morning workout. Those are the situations when she can win. But when another horse of similar quality looks her in the eye, it's like she shows no willingness to fight that horse off. She's just not a competitor. And she can be very good and win $1 million and win some big races and not be a horse that likes to compete that much. And that's okay, but she's just not a horse that's going to win a ton of Grade 1 races like that. So, I mean, Uni on this day, facing a really good field, is just going to run a horse like her down. Now, as for Uni, Joel Rosario gave her a good ride because she broke alertly and he didn't take away her tactical speed. He kept her within range early, and when they came to the top of the stretch, and Uni is within a length of Newspaper of Record, there's no way Newspaper of Record's beating Uni under that situation. So Uni was just able to run her down. Can she step up and beat the males again in the Breeders' Cup? I'm not going to put it past her, but it feels like she'll be probably too short of a price in that race just because she's the defending champion. So I think that Breeders' Cup Mile might be a race where you want to search for some value, but we'll get to that when it comes along.
Yeah, and just the one last thing on Newspaper of Record, I completely agree with you, and that's kind of what I was hinting at with the ride. I just didn't get the tactics of a moderate pace and letting some long shot go and run off in front of you. It's just the way she's going to win races is going to the front, going fast, and hope she can hang on. So hopefully that's the way she gets ridden in the future because, as you say, she's not going to fight, and that's really her only chance.
And we saw a number of graded stakes for the 2-year-olds at Keeneland last week, preps for the Breeders' Cup dirt races for the juveniles and some turf races. The Breeders' Futurity is obviously the prep for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, and Essential Quality, making his second career start for Brad Cox, was able to beat this field. There were some horses that looked like major players in this race from Saratoga that just didn't show up at all. So at the end of the day, Essential Quality was beating a few long shots in this race. But that said, he did it the right way, winning in dominant fashion. I just don't know what was behind him.
Yeah, it's tough to say. Just say there were some no-shows. He only got a 101 TimeformUS speed figure, which this time of the 2-year-olds this late in the year is no great shakes. It's not the thing that should make him a favorite in the Breeders' Cup or anything like that. So he did it the right way. He didn't go too fast. He just ran a kind of an even race throughout, which is what I like to see when 2-year-olds stretch out. You don't want to see them going too fast early and just kind of hanging on late. So from that, I thought it was a positive, but I don't think this was the strongest race we're going to see for this group.
Yeah, I couldn't quite make the case that there was any kind of bias at Keeneland this past weekend, and I'm not suggesting that, but just in terms of this race, all of the running behind him was done by horses that saved ground. There were a lot of horses that were trying to make up ground out wide, and they just seemed to be spinning their wheels, especially a horse like Founder, who just is incredibly green, and one crack of the whip in the left hand, and he's out to the center of the racetrack. I mean, he just doesn't know what he's doing. He's a horse that they need to figure out a little bit, but Essential Quality was just more professional than his rivals, and maybe that's going to come in to play on Breeders' Cup Day. But it seems like there might be some faster horses out there, especially in New York. We'll see what the Champagne brings this upcoming week. As for the 2-year-old filly prep that they ran at Keeneland this past week, that being the Alcibiades on Friday, we did see a pretty fast performance out of Simply Ravishing, who now is unbeaten in 3 starts in her career, once on turf, 2 on the dirt. She's obviously better on the dirt based on these last couple of efforts. And we've talked about some of the other 2-year-old fillies that are out there, particularly one in California that has a lot of fans. But Simply Ravishing, she's the fastest one that we've seen so far.
She is. She got a 109 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. It was a 112 on final time, actually knocked down because of pace. But I don't have any real knocks. I mean, how could you? This was a big effort from a 2-year-old filly. I do get a little leery when I see a race that essentially she was handed the lead. She was able to go in a very slow pace. All our fractions are coded in blue. So you do have to wonder what would happen going those 2 turns if she gets challenged a little bit early. But it's not like she's shown that she can't rate before. She rated off the lead on turf where the pace is generally slower and was able to finish strong. So I don't really have any knocks. It's just the fact that, like I said, she was kind of handed the lead, but it's not one of those things where we think she's a need to lead type, particularly this early in her career.
No, and she has that impressive win at Keeneland where they're going to be running the Breeders' Cup. If you think that's important, that horses get a race over the track and show an affinity for the track. She has that over on her main rival, Princess Noor, who is the other horse that's obviously going to attract a ton of support in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies. She's won the major races out in California pretty impressively. But, I mean, in my opinion, Simply Ravishing was just as impressive as Princess Noor in this race, beating arguably a better field and faster time. So, I think she's at the top of this division, at least from my perspective, and we'll see if any horses come from New York with similar credentials. I know that there are some good horses pointing to the Frizette, so we'll see, but I think she's the horse to beat in that race right now.
Yeah, I have no argument with that whatsoever, and I do like the race over the track, particularly Keeneland, which can be quirky at times. So, yeah, I think she's the favorite as we talk now.
Now, getting back to all that chaos heading into the Breeders' Cup Sprint, I don't think we got a whole lot of problems solved in the Grade 2 Phoenix, which was the other major stakes that was run at Keeneland last Friday. This one was going the 6 furlongs, and I mean, I don't think the distance really matters for the winner, Diamond Oops, who just seems like he can do anything, whether it be dirt or turf or short or long. This horse just always shows up with good efforts. I think he probably is best as a dirt sprinter. In a situation where a lot of horses just struggle with consistency, seems like he usually comes through, especially at Keeneland.
Yeah, what a cool horse he is. I mean, he's a horse who narrowly missed in the Shadwell last year going a mile on turf. Finished 4th in the Pegasus World Cup this year behind Mucho Gusto and won a turf sprint last time out. Now he's winning a Grade 2 dirt sprint. So just a really cool horse, the kind I love to get behind and follow. That said, he just kind of gets lumped in with all the other older males for me as far as the Breeders' Cup Sprint goes. He only won with a 118, which is not even really a Grade 2 figure, more like a Grade 3. And, you know, he does everything the right way, but I'm just looking for somebody to break out and run a fast race, and we're not seeing it yet. And I mean, we had a horse in here who was, I think, 70-something to 1 in Empire of Gold, a horse who had won his last race here at my home track of Remington Park with only a 104 speed figure, set the pace and very nearly held on and was able to hold on for second. So it's hard for me to think this was the strongest of preps for that Breeders' Cup Sprint.
No, I agree with you. I mean, the list of no-shows in this race was longer than those that ran top races. I mean, Whitmore just seems like he's not the same horse anymore. I mean, you could have given him a pass for not showing up in that sloppy forego last time, but this was a race where he was supposed to do well. I mean, he's run well at Keeneland in the past, and he just looked a little bit dull coming through the stretch. I mean, he was in a position where he could have been competitive in this race, and he couldn't even hold off Echo Town for third. And some of the others, like No Parole, who looked so good earlier in the year winning that Woody Stevens, I mean, boy, has he gone the wrong way. And I mean, I don't know if Tom Amoss will press on to the Breeders' Cup Sprint with him, or maybe this is incentive to rethink sending Serengeti Empress to the Sprint if his other speed horses aren't up for that race. He could control the pace with her. We'll see. There are a lot of scenarios that could play out with horses coming into that race, but I agree with you about Diamond Oops. It's hard not to root for this horse because he's just so cool. He really does anything. And like I said, he seems to really like Keeneland. I mean, whether it's the dirt or the turf, he's put up some big performances there, and that's where the Breeders' Cup is. Obviously, he has to get faster to win, but he's a horse who has run some faster speed figures in the past, so he's an interesting player in that Breeders' Cup Sprint.
He is, for sure. And yeah, No Parole for me was the real disappointment. Cutting back to 6, making the lead, and basically very slow time. I think his pace figure was in the low teens, and just not being able to do any running late was really disappointing.
One more race to mention from Saturday's card before we move on to Sunday. The Grade 2 Woodford going the 5.5 furlongs on the turf, a prep for the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint, obviously. Leinster got the job done over familiar faces. This year he's actually pulled off that Shakertown Woodford double. Didn't race at all in between there. He was coming off a layoff in this race, but you would think that would set him up for a good attempt at the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint at Keeneland.
Yeah, it's hard to think he's not one of, if not the favorite for the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint the way he's been running this year. He obviously loves Keeneland. He got a nice 120 Timeform US speed figure, which fits right in with all the the big turf sprints that we see. He's tactical. He's able to make up ground late when he has to. He's able to sit up close as he did on this day. So no real knocks on him. He's just reached his prime as a 5-year-old and is consistent as they come.
Yeah, I think what you said, his ability to close in this race, I think was a real benefit to him because they weren't going that quickly up front, and even a slightly inferior horse like Just Might was able to hold on for third in here. Perhaps some of the closers like Extravagant Kid, who was coming on late, and more so Chaos Theory, perhaps they were a little compromised in this race. But Leinster just showed up again, and like you said, a horse with that tactical speed is always going to be tougher in these races, so he's definitely a major player in that Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. Moving on to Sunday's card at Keeneland, they ran a couple of graded stakes, and then there's one more we'll talk about at the end of this list of races at Keeneland that earned a big speed figure. But speaking of that grade 1 prep for the Breeders' Cup Distaff, that being the Spinster, we saw an upset as Valiance beat the Kentucky Oaks winner She Dares the Devil, as well as the Tough Luck Ollie's Candy, who just can't seem to break through with a victory this year. I'll be honest, Valiance was 6-1 in this race. In my book, she could have been 16-1 because I didn't see where this performance came from based on her prior efforts.
Yeah, I didn't either. We're in the same boat there. She had won an off the turf stakes last time with a 111. She had done most of her career running on turf with mixed results. She hadn't really performed all that well in the. I'm trying to remember if she'd even tried stakes. I think she did once and she didn't run very well, but she had won a couple allowance races with nice figures, but I didn't know where this race came from. But it was a big one. So maybe she's just been a dirt filly that this is what she's wanted all along. She got a really nice figure in here, a 122, which was 10 points higher than she run last time out. She beat I want to say Tough Luck Ollie's Candy, but at this point, I'm not sure if she's just not a filly or mare, I forget if she's 5 yet, who just doesn't want to win very much these days. So she always seems to run a race. She got another 120 plus TimeformUS speed figure, but she just has trouble finding the winner circle, which is odd for a horse that won the first 3 times of her career. But I think since then, she's only won 1 time back at Santa Anita last year with a whole bunch of good but not winning races afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, Valiance, I remember her from earlier in her career. I think she ran a few races on the turf in Monmouth. I mean, she won, I think, her first 3 starts in a row, but she looked like one of these horses that got lucky a few times, got very good trips. The 2 dirt races that she had competed in were both off the turf, and as you said, that last one, I mean, it was a lower speed figure, and she wasn't beating that much. I don't know why they bet her down to 6-1. Maybe she was trading well. I don't know what the story was. Obviously, somebody knew she was going to improve in this race, and she really did. I will say the big disappointment here was probably She Dares the Devil. I found it surprising that Florent Giroux sent her to the front end because there was speed in this race. Lady Kate, you would have thought, would have been on the front end. Ollie's Candy has plenty of tactical speed, but Florent seemed pretty intent on getting to the front end with her, and she just faded late. They've since announced that she's not going to go on to the Breeders' Cup Distaff, so maybe it's just been a long, hard year for her, and they'll wait and bring her back as a 4-year-old. But she was the disappointment in here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I was surprised she went to the lead. Particularly, it's not like the pace was slow. We had all the pace figures in the 130s. I did see a lot of people acting like she just fell off a cliff and ran terrible, and where did her Oaks come from? But in reality, from us, she only got a speed figure 1 point lower than she did in that Kentucky Oaks win. It was just she was facing older horses here, one of them who jumped up and a solid performer in Ollie's Candy. And given that and the pace scenario where she found herself on the lead, I just think it wasn't the ideal circumstances for her to run her best race.
Sticking with Breeders' Cup preps, we saw a prep for the Juvenile Turf in the Grade 2 Bourbon, which was run earlier on the day in that Sunday card at Keeneland, and a horse that was actually trying the turf for the first time, and Mutasabek got the job done here, coming from way off the pace. This was a horse who hesitated at the start, found himself, I think, a lot farther back than anybody expected, but didn't matter. He just ran right over the top of this field in this stretch.
Yeah, that was a big effort from him, at least visually. Figure wise, it didn't come back all that strong. He only got a 91 from us. I will say it was a tough figure to make. There were 3 races on the turf, but they were all 2-year-old races. And sometimes it's really tough to say just how much these horses move forward. So it's possible he ran a faster race. All the fractions are coded in red, but I can only work with the data that I have, so I'm going to be cautious, and I'm not going to just arbitrarily bump the number up. But that said, he looked good visually, and it wouldn't surprise me if this horse was a player in the juvenile turf.
Yeah, I'll say I definitely feel for you with trying to make figures for some of these 2-year-old races because a lot of them haven't run that often. And I mean, handicapping this race as well as the Pilgrim and the Miss Grillo. I mean, there are a lot of figures with horses that made their debuts over the summer that I think were just tough races to get a handle on in terms of quality because they were just filled with so many first-time starters. And I mean, you can go back and try to revise races after the fact, but it's just tough to know how difficult these fields are until they face horses of like quality. And we'll see. I mean, I was impressed by Mutasabek here. I thought that while the pace was fast, there were other closers in this race, and he just kicked for home much more enthusiastically than they did. So we'll see if he can face a better field in the Breeders' Cup with some Muros coming over. But this was the kind of turf debut that you do want to see. Before we move away from Keeneland, one more race to discuss took place early in the day on Sunday. That was an allowance race, and we saw another rare appearance from Nick's Go, at least in 2020. He was switched over to the Brad Cox barn at the end of last year. He's only made 2 starts, though, since that trainer switch. They've both been fantastic. They just come very far apart, and he beat, a field of questionable quality here, but boy, did he run fast in doing it.
He did. This was a race that gave me some gray hair trying to make figures. But at the end of the day, unless I'm just going to arbitrarily bump it down for no real reason, because there were plenty other routes on the card before and after. Sprints usually line up well with the routes at Keeneland. So I used those as well. And it was just a huge number. There's not a whole lot you can add to it. He won by over 10 lengths. He got a 131 TimeformUS speed figure. He is a horse who's obviously run fast before. We talked about his race at Oaklawn this year, his lone race where he won by 7 lengths with a 120 TimeformUS speed figure. And we were both pretty high on him that day. Now, it took a while for him to get back, but he proved that race was no fluke. And, this is a horse who's always had some talent. He was a runner-up in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile after winning the Breeders' Futurity. Kind of went off the rails a little bit where he wasn't able to compete with his... it seemed like horses maybe had caught up to him maturation-wise, but whatever it was, he's back now because he is just running holes in the wind.
Yeah, this horse ran a big race. There's no doubt about it. And he's just a different horse for Brad Cox, which we've seen happen quite a few times this year. Not to say he wasn't good before, but he wasn't running these kinds of figures and winning as impressively as this. He did get that slow pace, and that obviously helped. But there's no doubt he ran fast. How fast did he run? Is that 131 and that 135 final time speed figure, are those legitimate? I don't know. I think you sounded a little skeptical. I'd be a little skeptical too. It always raises some red flags for me when a horse like Proverb, who finished 5th and lost by 15 lengths, is running a career best number. I don't know if I buy that. But sometimes races, you just have to give them these figures and see what happens. It kind of reminds me of that shared belief that they ran at Delmar over the summer, where just based on the surrounding races, that was an extremely fast race. Turns out when the horses run back, none of them run back to that figure. But that sometimes you just have to give the races the figures that they earn and see what happens.
Yeah, that's basically the thing. I don't want to get into a situation where I'm just arbitrarily knocking races down because I don't believe them, especially when a horse runs by 10 lengths. It's certainly one I'll monitor. I am going to take some time to time it today just to be sure, but this was one when I sat on, I was really hoping it would be one of those mile races where the run-up's a lot longer and maybe I could use that as an excuse. But I just really couldn't come up with any legitimate reason other than it just looks too fast to knock it down.
All right, let's move on to Belmont Park, where they had their own set of preps for the Breeders' Cup on Saturday and Sunday. We'll begin with the Saturday racing. They had a couple of Grade 1 events. The big one was the Grade 1 Joe Hirsch Turf Classic, and Channelmaker did something that we really haven't seen from him throughout his career, and that's win back-to-back races. He's now taken the Sword Dancer and the Turf Classic, both Grade 1 events, and he's done it in the same way. Got to the front end, slowed the pace down in the middle of the race, and then just kicked for home, and nobody could pass him. He probably wasn't facing a field of horses that really loves to pass other horses in general, but you can't deny that this horse has just kind of put it all together now in his 6-year-old year.
Yeah, I thought this was a really good effort. I suspected coming in that maybe he was just kind of a soft turf course star, but turns out he was just fine on this turf course. I think what we really found out is he's a horse you just have to put on the lead and see what happens, because all of his best races come when he's on the lead. We have the pace coded in red. Looking at the raw fractions, they're not supersonic or anything like that, but they're a lot faster than what you normally get for these 1.5-mile races. So it was a really solid effort for him. He got a 128 TimeformUS speed figure following that 130 he got last time. So just a really, really cool story for an older horse like him. It was one, if you'd have told me before the race, I actually bet the German horse Lucario that all I had to do was beat Channelmaker, I'd have been supremely confident, but he was just too good on this day.
I've got a question. I mean, this horse has now run TimeformUS speed figures of 130 and 128 in his last couple of starts. Is he an actual player in the Breeders' Cup Turf, or has he just been beating weaker fields? I mean, I know we always kind of assume that the Europeans are going to come over and dominate that race, and you've got United, who almost won that race last year, and I imagine many would view him as the leading American candidate for that race. But isn't Channelmaker a player based on his recent form?
Yeah, I think he's certainly a player, particularly if we don't get a whole lot of speed, which can happen in these races at times. It's hard to say who's going to show up, and I'm sure we'll address that. But I don't see any reason he wouldn't be a player based on this last one. And given that the Breeders' Cup's going to be at Keeneland, it's always possible he'll get the soft turf course that he likes even more than the firm we saw. That said, now I do have a question for you. Are we going to have an intervention with you on Sadler's Joy, or are you going to vow never to pick him again?
Well, I probably won't get too many more chances because he's a 7-year-old, and I would imagine his career is winding down at this point. But yeah, he had his chance in this race. Javier Castellano is always kind of between a rock and a hard place with him, having to make those wide far turn moves so that he doesn't have too much ground to make up in the stretch. But sometimes when you do that, it takes away from the late kick that he might have had if he held him up. So there really is no right move with this horse. I guess he ran his race. Channelmaker was just better on this day. But no, I don't foresee myself finding an opportunity to bet him again, unless maybe he winds up in that Red Smith at Aqueduct. But that's getting ahead of myself. We'll see. Let's talk about another turf race that took place on Saturday at Belmont. The other longer race, not a marathon, was the Belmont Derby, going 1.25 miles for the 3-year-olds. And Gufo, he beat this field and got the job done as the favorite. I will say that this race left me a little bit cold because, I mean, when you got a long shot like Mo Reddy, who they just left alone in the front end through moderate fractions, and he's able to be a part of the finish after coming out of some New York bred races as an inferior horse, just kind of makes me wonder how strong this field was and whether some horses behind him didn't get the best rides, which I think when you watch the race, you can make that case. So I just don't know what to make of this race overall.
Yeah, I saw your tweet and I kind of laughed. And the reason I laughed because I actually bet Mo Reddy, not because I think he's any good, just because I saw the exact scenario playing out that did. And he hung around for a long time. He's just not quite good enough. But at 30-1 or whatever he was, I thought his kind was worth a shot. But that said, as you mentioned, I just don't think this is the strongest race. I'd only got a 112 TimeformUS speed figure, the same kind of figure we saw in the Saratoga Derby where Domestic Spending won this race. He was scratched out of here, but he beat Gufo by a head, and just not the strongest field. There's practically zero chance any of these 3-year-olds could step up into a race like the Breeders' Cup and be competitive. So didn't want to spend a lot of time on this, but it is a grade 1. And Gufo finally got that big stakes win that we've been thinking he would get for a while, but just not a strong race for me.
And one other thing I'll note is that having position towards the rail seemed very important, especially on the inner turf course at Belmont this past weekend. And you'll notice this race was dominated by the 3 horses that rode the rail the entire way. 2 of them from the Tom Pletcher barn, and one of them that long shot that you mentioned, Mo Reddy. So I think that really did play a factor in these horses completing the trifecta. Some horses did not get great rides in here. I mean, I'm a little bitter about the ride that Pixelate got because I thought he had a big chance in this race. Jose Lascano's been riding great at Belmont. I do not know how this horse who broke second and had that position stalking outside Mo Reddy an eighth of a mile into the race was somehow last by the time they got to the backstretch. I still can't wrap my head around that. He ran well to be 5th, but just can't win with that trip. Moving on to the dirt racing, we saw a prep for the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, that being the Grade 2 Kelso on Saturday, and 2 of the top milers in training, at least on the dirt, faced off in this race in Complexity and Code of Honor, and I've got to be honest, I've never been the biggest fan of Complexity because he just doesn't seem like the kind of horse that finishes off his races with a lot of purpose. I mean, he's got plenty of natural speed, but when he gets into a real dogfight, I haven't seen him assert his dominance. That was not the case in this Kelso. They came to the quarter pole, and Code of Honor ranged up outside, and Complexity just turned him away.
He did. Now, I do think part of that was due to the moderate pace which we saw in this race. But as you said, it's not like Code of Honor was trying to come from way back. He got up pretty close and just got outkicked late. So I thought it was a really good effort from Complexity. He got a 128 TimeformUS speed figure, which I think is the best of his career. And just a really good effort. Quite a training job by Chad Brown. I've talked about that with some other horses. No real surprise. I mean, he's one of the best trainers, if not the best in the country. But this horse has definitely had some ups and downs, and his downs have been big ones. But when this horse shows up ready to run, he's fast and dangerous. As far as Breeders' Cup go, I really don't know what they're going to do with him. I'm not sure he wants the 2 turns that the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile would be. So not sure he wants the short 6 furlongs of the Breeders' Cup Sprint, so it'll be interesting for me to see which direction Chad Brown goes with him.
Yeah, in my mind, the Dirt Mile is definitely the best race for him. I mean, they could try to turn him back in distance. I think that would be a mistake because the 6 furlongs is just a different beast than the kind of races that he's been in. He really hasn't gone that short since his career debut. I don't know. I mean, he obviously didn't handle the 2 turns in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. That was the one time he tried it. I think he's a different horse since then, so maybe things will be different now. We'll see. But based on this performance, he's just in the best form of his career. As for Code of Honor, I don't know where they go. I guess the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile could be an option, especially if there's more pace in there, which would seem likely. The Classic, I mean, that's where they raced him last year, or maybe they could do that kind of Kelso to Classic move that Shug made with Honor Code a number of years ago. I don't know. It seems like maybe he hasn't taken that step forward that we had hoped that he had from his 3-year-old to 4-year-old season. But it's not like he loses anything in defeat here because, as you said, he was against it from a pace standpoint.
Yeah, and he did. He ran well. He got a 125 TimeformUS speed figure, which is his best this year. But I do have concerns, as you do, because he's a horse who had run 126 and 127 late in his 3-year-old season. So he should be beating that by now. So maybe he just hasn't gone far enough. Maybe he truly wants to go 1.25 miles, which is where he ran those figures in the Travers and the Jockey Club Gold Cup. But I do have some reservations with him. Personally, I'd go in the Classic just on the distance factor, take a shot. But, he's going to run into some pretty stout competition in that field.
Moving on to Sunday's card at Belmont, they ran the Grade 2 Beldame, prep for the Breeders' Cup Distaff, and Dunbar Road was made the even money favorite in this race. I mean, no surprise there. She had been, I think, undefeated so far this year, though she hadn't faced a real test. And obviously, she had a setback coming into this race. It forced her to miss, I think, the Personal Lens Center, a startup at Saratoga. But she just didn't look like herself. She was never really traveling well. Latruska ran off on the front end, and I think that threw everyone for a loop, including her, because she had nothing left for the finish. But Horologist was there to pick up the pieces, and she's just turned into a much more consistent horse since this trainer switch to Bill Mott.
Yeah, she's been running for a long time without a break and just cranking out good race after good race. Other than that one she had at Santa Anita, forget what happened there where she got pulled up. But otherwise, she's just a horse who runs right around that high teens 120 speed figure. And in this race, she had the tactical speed to stay closest, not necessarily close, but closest to Latruska, and just kind of inherited the lead when that one packed it in and won easily. I think she won by 3 lengths. It was an interesting race in that in a 4 horse field, Dunbar Road was even money, and actually all of the other 3 horses had run faster than her recently. So as a speed figure guy, I wasn't really a big fan of Dunbar Road. I wound up sitting this one out, just didn't see a lot of value. But looking back, that was probably a mistake because Horologist at 7-1 had every reason to win this race. Just looking at the rest of the field.
I will say Junior Alvarado gave a subtly brilliant ride on Horologist because typically these 4 horse fields, when there's one speed horse, you see everybody take back and let that speed horse just do its own thing on the front end. But Junior came out with a real purpose, like he was going to the front, and what he did was he set off Latruska, because the one thing you can't do with Latruska is challenge her for the lead and make her go too fast. That's how you beat her. And he challenged her in the quarter mile, made her run too fast down the backstretch, but he was able to turn off his filly, and he just let Latruska go after she was so fired up and took Horologist back to kind of sit with the rest of the field. And then when it was time for Latruska to come back to the rest of the pack, he got the jump on them. So I thought it was just a real, it was a thinking man's ride by Junior Alvarado, and just excellent tactics on the best horse anyway.
I'm starting to think Point of Honor is maybe a soulmate of Ollie's Candy as well. If she couldn't get it done in here with this pace, she just seems like a horse who's always going to run well, but not well enough to win these big races. Maybe if they ran more at 1.25 miles, she'd have a chance. I think that'd probably be her best distance, but she's just not going to get that chance. So she just seems like a perennial bridesmaid to me.
I think you're being a little mean to my girl Ollie's Candy. She's run well every time this year. I know she's got those 5 losses in Grade 1 races, but a few of them in photo finishes. I mean, she tries hard. She's been trying to win those photos. She's just been a little bit unlucky. I'm going to stick by that. Let's finish up the racing from Belmont. We've got... we can wrap the Gallant Bloom they ran on Saturday. I don't think either of us have a whole lot to say about that one. Frank's Rocket was, I don't know, like 1 to 100, and she beat that field pretty easily. Maybe she goes on to the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint off this performance. But I don't know. I didn't have a whole lot of things to say about this race.
No, I don't know what to make of her yet. The one time she really got tested at Oaklawn, she came up lacking. I think it's just for some reason Bill Mott keeps finding these great spots to put her in where she basically can't lose. But eventually she's going to step up and face better horses, and I would be against her. She just hasn't run fast enough. She always looks great, and would it shock me if she ran a big race? No, but she's definitely the kind I'm going to want to bet against, because I think her past performances are very dressed up.
Like they did at Keeneland, they ran a couple of 2-year-old races this past weekend at Belmont, preps for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf and Juvenile Fillies Turf, and I think we saw a pretty big disparity in quality between the females and the males, as the colts just... I don't know how good this group is in the Pilgrim. Fire at Will, who was a long shot in this race, got to the front end, was able to slow the pace down, and nobody really did a whole lot of running from the back of the pack. The speed figure came back very low, which I know you can talk about a little bit. I just don't know what's in this field.
Yeah, I think when I wrote to you about the speed figure, I mentioned this when I was a little concerned about the discrepancy between the two. But as I look back on them, I think I'm more concerned about the one we're going to talk about next, and I'll probably revisit that one. I don't think this was a very strong field. Fire at Will got it, as I call it these days, the Naira trip, where he was just handed the early lead and nobody was able to catch him. He set moderate fractions. I don't think anybody behind him was particularly good. I mean, the 4-5 favorite, Public Sector, the Chad Brown horse, was coming in off just an 80 TimeformUS speed figure. So I don't have any problems with this. An 87 for the winner. Just don't think it was a big race. And I'd much prefer the winner at Keeneland of their race in this division to this one.
Yeah, it's funny you call this the Naira trip, because I think one of the symptoms that we see of there being so many slow paces on the turf, especially in these route races, is that a pace like this in the Pilgrim, which it was slow. This was a slow pace, but I guess when you put it in context of the other races and how they typically ride, it's not an outlier. So, I mean, the fractions are in all color-coded blue, but don't be mistaken. Fire at Will had a big advantage over the rest of this field, especially because this was another inner turf race where he was on the rail the entire way. And I mean, I don't want to be too hard on Javier Castellano, but I just don't know what he was thinking going 4 wide to make that move on public sector when it seemed like there was no reason to. I guess you could argue public sector was best in this race, but like you, I would prefer the horses coming out of the Bourbon. The filly version of this race, the Miss Gorilla, which was run on Sunday, got the much faster figure, which I know you want to comment on. I do think this was a stronger race, for sure. Plum Ali coming into here, she had not really been tested yet, had beaten an overmatched field at Saratoga, and then a weaker group at Kentucky Downs, but had done it by daylight. And she really didn't face a challenge here either. I mean, she was riding the rail for much of the way, which, as I said, this was another inner turf race that helps. But so were the other horses that were her main challengers, Cal D and Editor at Large. And Plum Ali just made that mid-race move to take over and won off and beat them fair and square. And I think the horses behind her are actually pretty good.
Yeah, it's another one. As I said, I wanted to really look back at these figures because this one came back pretty quick, and I would imagine this horse probably goes favored in the juvenile filly turf off this effort with this kind of number. And I really couldn't find a reason not to give it that figure. I wanted to. I shouldn't say I wanted to, but I was really leery. But looking back, there was another race at the distance. They were for maiden claimers, but at least it was older horses who had run several times, many on turf. So I don't really have a big problem with it. I just think this is a talented filly, and this was just a much better race than we saw in the Pilgrim.
Yeah, I mean, you see big improvements from the top 3 finishers based on their prior numbers. Like I was saying earlier, I think it's tough to make some of those speed figures for the races with a lot of first-time starters. I think especially the figure that Editor at Large got for her debut, that's a difficult one because the pace was so slow in that race compared to the other division. It's getting kind of in the weeds, but I wouldn't be too disconcerted by the fact that these horses all seem to improve a lot because they did beat the other 2 runners by 15 lengths. And when I was first watching this race, I thought, oh, that was kind of a bad loss for Caldi because she looked like the lone speed and she got run down in this race. But then you look at the pace figures and the fractions, and they really pushed her through the middle portion of that race. And I mean, credit to Plum Ali because she made the first move after her. But I didn't think it was as bad of a loss by Caldi as I originally felt.
Yeah, I'd agree. And we do have the fractions coded in red. I know some people will probably look at the raw fractions and question that, but it goes back to what you were saying. It's just how these races get run at NYRA. These are actually quick fractions for that final time. So that's where the red comes from. It's something I'm going to work on over the winter with these turf races. Maybe find a way, because it does seem like paces are slowing down. And that's something I build in. I do update these things every year. So if anything, it's probably going to get even worse. So it's something I have in my projects to do in the slower post-Breeders' Cup end of the year.
All right, we've got one more race to discuss before wrapping up this week's podcast, and that's one from California. They ran most of their Breeders' Cup preps at Santa Anita last weekend, but they had one more this week, the City of Hope Mile, Grade 2 event prep for the Breeders' Cup Mile. And Mo Forza, no surprise, won this race at a very short price. He's just the king of that California Mile turf division, and they worked out a great trip for him in this race, just not a whole lot of drama.
Yeah, I mean, I was impressed with his run. He got a 123 TimeformUS speed figure, which he'd need to improve if he was going to compete in the Breeders' Cup Mile, or yeah, he wouldn't be in the Breeders' Cup Turf, but in the Breeders' Cup Mile. But he does have the look of a horse who could do it. I mean, he's basically winning all of his races easy. He didn't run well in the Pegasus, but he didn't run terrible, but it was at a mile and 3/16. He had a wide trip around the turn early. Just didn't really show up that day, but I think this horse is good. He's probably better than his figures indicate. You see this on turf races sometimes where you only can beat the horses put in front of you. We don't often see big margins on turf, which kind of compresses the speed figures a bit. Sharp Samurai, who finished second, is a decent enough horse. Personally, I'd like to see him stay on turf and get a few more, or on dirt, and get a few more shots there. But we know what he is on turf. He had his measure all the way and beat him easily. So if I were actually going to put a number like a Timeform style rating on this horse, where it wasn't simply speed, I would say he's a grade 1 type. I'd probably say he's more like a 128 horse than a 123.
Oh, I completely agree with that. I don't want to be dismissive of Mo Forza. I mean, I was just kind of conveying that he was better than this field, but I agree. He's really good. I was extremely impressed by his race at Del Mar last time and his return from the layoff. I mean, he's now won, 6 of his last 7 starts, with that one loss coming when he got a nightmare trip in the Pegasus World Cup turf, going a distance that might be too far for him. He is really good, and he obviously has kind of turned into a 1-mile specialist lately, and that's kind of the reason that I was being a little bit just hesitant to say that Uni could be competitive in a Breeders' Cup Mile again, because it seems like the American contingent coming into the Breeders' Cup Turf Mile this year is a lot stronger than it was from top to bottom last year. It's deep, Evar. I mean, we'll see what factor this does if he goes in that race, but it just seems like there are a lot of horses that are running faster speed figures than we saw coming into that race last year.
Yeah, Mo Forza's also got good tactical speed. He came from pretty far behind in this one. It's kind of been his MO, not pretty far behind, but mid-pack. But when he has to, he's shown good early speed and has been able to run up pretty close to the lead and still have that strong late finish as well.
Well, that's all of the racing to recap this week. I know there was a lot of it, and there's a lot to digest. I mean, that Preakness that on Saturday seems like it was ages ago at this point, having watched all these replays. But that was an excellent race. We didn't really talk about the Breeders' Cup implications of that one. I don't know if they're going to try the Breeders' Cup Distaff with Swiss Skydiver. I'd imagine they would, but it would be great to see her in action again one more time before the end of the year. It would appear that she's sewn up that 3-year-old filly Eclipse Award. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of drama in that one. But I'm sure we'll talk about these races a lot more with the Breeders' Cup approaching. We can do some contender deep dives and some Pacecasts in coming weeks when the prep races are a little bit quieter, maybe 2 and 3 weeks out from the Breeders' Cup. So we'll see how that shapes up. But in the near future, we'll do a TimeformUS forecast later this week. I think they've got a big Saturday of racing coming up once again at Belmont Park. I know the Jockey Club Gold Cup is scheduled for this Saturday along with the Flower Bowl. I think there are even some the Champagne and the Frisette are being run this weekend. So we'll come up with something to do some handicapping with for this Friday's forecast. For now, remember, you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and look out for that TimeformUS forecast on Friday.